On a clear day, if you're standing on Kauai's western shore, you can see it. A low brown silhouette on the horizon, close enough that it looks like you could swim there. That's Niihau, roughly 70 square miles, about the size of Washington, D.C., home to maybe 70 people, and closed to everyone else on Earth for over a century. The people who own it bought the whole thing for $10,000. To understand how that's possible, you have to go back to 1864. Hawaii wasn't a state, it wasn't a territory. It was a kingdom, the Kingdom of Hawaii, ruled by Kamehameha V, and like most Pacific Island monarchies in the mid-19th century, it had a cash problem. The crown needed money. Land was one of the few things it could sell. Enter Elizabeth Sinclair, a Scottish-born widow who'd already moved her family and their cattle operation from New Zealand to British Columbia, looking for a permanent home. She had money, she had ambition, and she had a very specific idea of what good land looked like, which is why the next part of the story sounds like a punchline. Sinclair reportedly turned down other parcels of Hawaiian land. The exact properties are debated, but multiple accounts suggest she was offered acreage in areas that would eventually become some of the most valuable real estate in human history. She passed. She looked at Niihau, dry, treeless, covered in scrub grass, hammered by wind, and saw what a rancher sees: open grazing country with no competition. To anyone else, the island looked like the reject pile. Niihau sits in Kauai's rain shadow. The mountains on Kauai's western side squeeze the moisture out of the trade winds before they cross the channel, leaving Niihau with roughly 20 inches of rainfall a year. For context, the summit of Mount Waialeale on Kauai, 17 miles away, has averaged over 400 inches of rain a year, making it one of the wettest spots on Earth. One of the rainiest peaks on the planet is a short boat ride from a near desert. Same ocean, same latitude, completely different world. That dryness is the most important geographic fact about Niihau. It's why sugar planters never wanted the island. Sugar cane needs rain, and Niihau has almost none. It's why resort developers never circled it the way they circled Maui and the North Shore, because dry coastline without a deepwater harbor doesn't attract investment. And it's why a Scottish ranching widow could buy an entire Hawaiian island for $10,000 in gold. In today's dollars, you'd spend more on a new pickup truck. A single beachfront acre on Maui now sells for more than Sinclair paid for 70 square miles. Kamehameha V took the deal. But the transaction carried something beyond the receipt, an understanding, informal but real, that Sinclair and her descendants would look after the native Hawaiian community already living on the island. This wasn't written into a contract. It wasn't legally enforceable. It was a promise between a king and a rancher, the kind of agreement that holds up in no court and has somehow held up for 160 years anyway. When Sinclair's descendants married into the Robinson family, the Robinsons kept the promise, and they kept the deed. For over a century and a half, the same extended family has owned the entire island under the simplest and most powerful form of property ownership in American law: fee simple. No trust, no tribal reservation, no government co-management, no board of directors voting on access. One family holds the title, and one family decides who sets foot on the land. That's the part most people get wrong about Niihau. They hear Forbidden Island and assume there's a federal agency involved, a military perimeter, a state parks department with a locked gate. There's none of that. Niihau's gate is a private front door, and in the United States, a property owner's right to say no visitors is nearly absolute. You can't petition your way onto someone's ranch. You can't file a Freedom of Information request for someone's living room. The Robinsons don't owe anyone a reason. They just need the deed, and they've had it since Abraham Lincoln was in the White House. One family paid less for a Hawaiian island than a Ford F-150 costs today, and the receipt from 1864 is still the only thing standing between Niihau and a Hilton. But a deed is paper, and paper only holds up as long as the person holding it can afford the grip. Owning 70 square miles of Hawaiian land means property taxes, infrastructure costs, and a cattle operation running on an island where rain barely shows up. By the middle of the 20th century, the financial math was already getting ugly. Any rational economic actor would have sold a strip of beachfront, banked the millions, and moved on with life. The Robinsons did not sell. And the reason has to do with what happened on December 7th, 1941, the same day the world heard about Pearl Harbor. That afternoon, a Japanese fighter pilot crash-landed on Niihau. What happened over the next week did not just make international news. It permanently changed how the island saw the outside world, and it locked the gate in a way no property deed ever could. Hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, a Japanese Zero piloted by Airman First Class Shigenori Nishikaichi took ground fire over Oahu and could not make it back to his carrier. His backup plan, assigned before the mission, was to fly to Niihau, which Japanese intelligence had identified as an uninhabited island where a submarine could later retrieve him. Japanese intelligence was wrong. Niihau was not uninhabited. Nishikaichi crash-landed in a field, and one of the first people to reach the wreck was Hawila Kaliohano, a native Hawaiian resident who did not yet know about Pearl Harbor. Nobody on Niihau did. The island had no telephone and no two-way radio, no cable, no telegraph, no way to reach the outside world, and no way to know that the United States had just entered a world war. Kaliohano saw the pilot's uniform, took his pistol and the plane's documents on instinct, and brought the stranger into the community to figure out what to do. Think about that situation. 130 or so people on a dry island in the middle of the Pacific. No communication with anyone. A foreign pilot from an unknown situation carrying weapons. The nearest law enforcement, the nearest anyone, is a rough channel crossing to Kauai, and nobody's making that trip on short notice. For several days, the community housed Nishikaichi while trying to make contact with Kauai. What happened next turned a crash landing into a crisis. 3 Niihau residents of Japanese descent, 2 immigrants and 1 American-born, became entangled with the pilot. The most involved, a married couple who served as translators, eventually helped Nishikaichi recover weapons, seize the papers back, and attempt to take control of the situation by force. Whether they acted out of ethnic loyalty, fear, coercion, or sheer panic has been debated for 80 years. The answer is probably some combination of all 4. But the effect was immediate. An armed man, aided by locals the community had trusted, was now threatening a tiny, isolated village with no backup coming. The standoff ended when Ben Kanahele, a native Hawaiian rancher, confronted Nishikaichi directly. The pilot shot Kanahele 3 times, in the chest, the hip, and the groin. Kanahele, still standing, grabbed Nishikaichi and threw him against a stone wall. Kanahele's wife struck the pilot with a rock, and Kanahele finished the fight with a knife. Nishikaichi was dead. One of the Japanese residents who'd helped him took his own life the same evening. Ben Kanahele survived his wounds and later received the Medal for Merit and the Purple Heart. He became a quiet legend in Hawaii, the man who took 3 bullets and ended a wartime hostage crisis on an island the rest of America didn't know existed. But the incident didn't end on Niihau. It echoed. The U.S. Navy compiled an after-action report noting that American residents of Japanese ancestry had assisted an enemy combatant. The degree to which the Niihau incident influenced the federal government's decision to intern over 120,000 Japanese Americans is debated by historians. Some researchers argue the Navy's report was cited directly in early internment discussions. Others say the political momentum was already unstoppable, and Niihau was a footnote at most. What's not debated is this: a tiny island with no phone line, where a crash landing went wrong for a week, became one data point in one of the worst civil liberties decisions in American history. On Niihau itself, the lesson was simpler and more permanent. The one time the outside world arrived uninvited, it brought a gun. Locals helped the stranger. People got shot. The community handled it alone because no one was coming to help. And here's what most people miss about the timeline. The island was already closed. Aubrey Robinson, Elizabeth Sinclair's grandson, had formally shut Niihau to outside visitors back in 1915, partly to shield the native Hawaiian residents from diseases that had already killed children on the island. By 1941, Niihau had carried its Forbidden Island nickname for over 2 decades. But the closure before the war had been a family policy, firm, principled, ultimately a choice. The Niihau incident turned that choice into something harder. The family's instinct calcified into a worldview. The outside world does not improve Niihau. Contact brings risk. Isolation is not a policy preference, it is a survival strategy. The U.S. military, far from objecting, effectively endorsed the arrangement. During and after the war, the military used portions of Niihau for observation, training, and ordnance testing. The federal government treated the island's isolation as a strategic asset, not an obstacle. Nobody in Washington pushed the Robinsons to unlock the gate. If anything, the war gave the lock a second deadbolt. That mindset has held for over 80 years. Through statehood, through the tourism boom, through the internet, through every wave of change that reshaped the rest of Hawaii beyond recognition, the Robinsons held the same line. No visitors, no developers, no exceptions worth the risk. And for decades, that was enough. A deed, a promise, a trauma, and a philosophy. 4 layers of lock, each reinforcing the others. But there's a force none of those layers can stop. And it's been eating at Niihau since long before the war. The island doesn't make money. Cattle ranching on a dry, harborless island 17 miles from the nearest supply chain is not a profitable business model. By the late 20th century, the Robinsons weren't wealthy recluses guarding a gold mine. They were broke ranchers sitting on a billion-dollar piece of real estate they refused to sell. Every financial advisor, every developer, every calculator in the world said the same thing: open the gate. They said no, and the cost of that refusal is stranger than anything the pilot brought with him. They own an entire island. 70 square miles of Hawaiian land with miles of undeveloped coastline, white sand beaches that have never seen a resort umbrella, and waters so untouched that the reef systems are among the healthiest in the main Hawaiian chain. On paper, the asset is almost incomprehensibly valuable. When raw beachfront on Maui and the Big Island moves for tens of thousands of dollars per foot, an entire island of pristine Hawaiian coast enters a category of value that most appraisers would struggle to calculate. Reports over the years have suggested the Robinsons have fielded offers in the hundreds of millions. Some accounts put the figure higher. They said no every time, and they said no while losing money. The ranch operated at thin margins or outright losses for decades. Niihau's 20 or so inches of annual rainfall can't support serious agriculture. The island has no deepwater harbor, so everything, feed, supplies, equipment, people, travels by barge or small boat across a channel that gets rough enough in winter to cut the island off entirely. Property taxes on 70 square miles of Hawaiian land, even with agricultural exemptions, are a real and recurring burden. The family also shoulders the cost of basic infrastructure for the community, power, water systems, the basics of daily survival in a place the county government essentially can't service. So the Robinsons improvised. They started a honey operation. Niihau's isolation means the island's bees have never been exposed to the varroa mite that has devastated colonies across the mainland and much of Hawaii. Niihau honey is high quality and genuinely rare, but selling artisanal honey doesn't offset the carrying costs of an island. They tried charcoal production. They explored other small-scale ventures. Each one brought in a little revenue. None solved the fundamental problem. The island costs more to hold than it earns. The most visible compromise came in the form of helicopter tours. Niihau Helicopters, operated by the Robinson family, offers limited excursions, typically landing on a remote beach far from the village, allowing a handful of paying visitors a few hours on the sand, maybe some hunting or snorkeling. The prices reportedly run several $100s per person. But the key restriction is absolute. Tourists do not visit the community. They don't see the village. They don't interact with residents. The helicopter sets down on an empty stretch of coast. The visitors get their pristine beach, and then they leave. It's a pressure valve, not an open door. Meanwhile, the island's residents have built their own microeconomy around something the gate itself made valuable. Niihau is the only source of pupu niihau, tiny, jewel-colored shells, some smaller than a grain of rice, that wash up on the island's beaches and nowhere else in the world. Residents collect them by hand, sort them by size and color, and string them into lei of extraordinary precision and beauty. A single Niihau shell lei can sell for hundreds of dollars. Museum-quality pieces have sold for thousands. The craftsmanship is generational. Techniques pass from mother to daughter, refined over lifetimes, and the supply is permanently limited by geography and access. Nobody else can harvest these shells because nobody else can get to the beach. There's an irony in that. The gate that keeps the world out is the same force that makes the shells valuable. Open Niihau to visitors and the beaches get picked clean in a season. The lock creates the value. Break the lock and you destroy the thing worth selling. That paradox runs through every financial decision the Robinsons face. Sell a strip of coast and you fund the ranch for a generation, but you invite development that makes the rest of the island impossible to keep closed. Build a resort and you create jobs, but you import the economy that killed traditional life on every other Hawaiian island. Every option that solves the money problem accelerates the cultural one, and every option that preserves the culture deepens the financial hole. The Robinsons have chosen the hole. Consistently across generations, in the face of offers that would make most landowners weep with gratitude, they've chosen to sell honey and helicopter rides and hold the line. This is not a rational economic decision. It is a moral one. The family is honoring a promise made to a king who's been dead for over a century, on behalf of a community that could leave anytime it wanted. Whether you find that admirable or paternalistic depends on where you stand. And that question, who benefits from the lock and who pays for it, is exactly where the story gets most complicated. Because behind the gate, roughly 70 people still live on Niihau. And what a century of isolation preserved there might be the last intact version of something the rest of Hawaii spent 50 years trying to get back. And the only reason it survived is that nobody showed up to replace it. Here's a number that should stop you cold. By the early 1980s, fewer than 50 children under the age of 18 anywhere in Hawaii were native speakers of Hawaiian, and most of them lived on one island. An entire language, the language of a kingdom, of a centuries-old civilization, of chance and navigation and law, had been reduced to a handful of grandparents and a few dozen kids, the majority of them on Niihau, in a state of nearly 1 million people. On every other island, Hawaiian had collapsed. On Niihau, it never stopped being the first language. Not as a revival project, not as an immersion program, not as a cultural reclamation effort funded by grants, the kind of work that has done heroic things on the other islands since the 1980s, but is, by definition, a rescue operation for something that already fell apart. On Niihau, there was nothing to rescue. Hawaiian is the language of the dinner table, the church service, the playground argument, the gossip between neighbors hanging laundry. It's the language children hear first and speak without thinking about it. It never left because the thing that kills indigenous languages everywhere else on Earth never arrived. That thing is economic replacement. The pattern is well documented and almost universal. A dominant language shows up carrying jobs, schools, media, government paperwork, and commercial opportunity. The indigenous language retreats, first from public life, then from schools, then from young people who realize their career prospects depend on fluency in the new one. Within 2 or 3 generations, the old language lives only in the mouths of elders and in recordings made by linguists who showed up just in time to press record before the last speaker died. Niihau broke the pattern by removing the mechanism. No outside economy arrived to offer English language jobs. No television broadcast in English filled the living rooms. The island had no television reception for most of its modern history. No internet connection exposed children to a world that operated in a different tongue. The school on Niihau taught in Hawaiian. The community conducted its affairs in Hawaiian. The church held services in Hawaiian. And because no competing economic system showed up to make English necessary for survival, nobody switched. The geography that made Niihau economically worthless, dry, small, no harbor, no freshwater rivers, no reason for any industry to set up shop, is exactly what made it culturally irreplaceable. Niihau's poverty and its cultural survival are not separate facts. They are the same fact, viewed from different angles. Residents live without most of what the rest of America considers non-negotiable. no paved roads. Rain catchment for water, solar panels for electricity, both relatively recent additions. No stores. Supplies come by barge when the channel cooperates and don't come when it doesn't. Medical care means a trip to Kauai. The island's school situation has been unstable for years, with reports of closures and children commuting or boarding on Kauai to continue their education. This is a critical point that most Forbidden Island narratives gloss over. The residents of Niihau are not prisoners. They can leave whenever they want. Many do. They travel to Kauai for shopping, medical appointments, and family visits. Younger residents leave for education and jobs and often don't come back. The population has been declining for decades, from 170 as recently as 2010 to roughly half that number today. Nobody is forcing anyone to stay. The gate that keeps the outside world out does not keep residents in. And that's the real threat to Niihau. Not developers, not the government, not some corporate hostile takeover of the coastline. The thing that will eventually undo a century of closure is the same force that empties every rural community in America. Young people leave for work and don't return. The population curve bends in only one direction. Each generation is smaller than the last. Each departure takes a fluent Hawaiian speaker out of a community that has no way to replace them. The Hawaiian sovereignty movement has a complicated relationship with all of this. Some advocates point to Niihau as proof that native Hawaiian self-determination can work, a community that maintained its language, its practices, and its identity because it was shielded from the forces that dismantled those things everywhere else. Others see a different picture, a native Hawaiian community whose access to healthcare, economic opportunity, and the modern world is mediated by a single private family of European descent that answers to no one. The word forbidden cuts in more than one direction. There's no clean answer to that tension, and anyone who offers one is selling something. The isolation that preserved the culture is inseparable from the poverty that's shrinking the community. Bring in the economy and you save the population numbers, but almost certainly kill the language within a generation, the same way it died everywhere else. Keep the economy out and you preserve the language in a community that gets smaller every year, until the last fluent speaker locks the door of the last occupied house and takes the boat to Kauai. Even Niihau's voting pattern is a relic of its isolation. The island reliably delivers a near-unanimous Republican vote in one of the most democratic states in the country, a political alignment set decades ago and never disrupted, because the forces that shift political opinion elsewhere, media, migration, changing demographics, national cultural trends, simply never penetrated the channel. If you're standing on Kauai's western shore at sunset, you can still see Niihau on the horizon. A low brown shape against the water, close enough to make out the ridgeline, far enough that the details disappear. From that distance, it looks like every other Hawaiian island, just quieter. But what's behind that silence is not an empty resort being hoarded by a rich family. It's a language being spoken in kitchens. It's a community held together by a promise nobody is legally required to honor. It's a gate that costs more to keep shut every single year, held in place by stubbornness and sacrifice and a financial equation that cannot hold forever. And somewhere on the other side of that channel, in a house with no paved road and no running water, someone is stringing shells smaller than a grain of rice into a lei that will sell for more than most people's weekly paycheck, in a language that almost no one else on Earth still speaks at home. The map doesn't show any of that. Maps never do.